Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. EU's top court makes a landmark ruling concerning social media such as Facebook. According to this ruling, individual countries can now order social media platforms to delete posts globally. Facebook is hitting back, saying it's going to sue the EU court for its decision that it sees as being impractical. Now, it's no secret that governments around the world want to limit the power of Facebook and other platforms. But is government intervention the only way to make social media more safe? We take a closer look at this story. Joining us for this discussion today, Mr. Santosh Rao, Head of Research at Manhattan Venture Partners, joining us from New Jersey. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Rao. Now, when we're talking about this, and before we get to what the governments are doing, let's talk about what Facebook and all these major social media platforms have done after scandal have broken out regarding their privacy breaches, after so much other stuff that has happened. Do you think they're doing enough to secure the content that is online?
Yes, at a very high level, they are. They're being very proactive. The thing right now is you have to realize that social media has penetrated every aspect of our life. So it's going to take some time to really turn the ship around or fine-tune this whole the mechanism. And they're doing it. I mean, Facebook is already under pressure here in the United States, and it kind of lends itself to abuse. But they have been pretty proactive, and they have said to some extent they're open to regulations. But in this case, it just looks like it's too broad-based. It's very impractical to really enforce it. So there has to be some middle ground. I'm sure it'll be appealed by Facebook. So hopefully, in the end, they come to some kind of middle ground which is more practical and more doable and enforceable. In this case, it just looks very difficult to really enforce this, what they are requiring at this point.
And you mentioned that word there, practical. What do you mean by that? That's something that Facebook also mentions, that this just isn't practical. It's not possible to do. Why is that so?
See, censoring stuff, removing stuff, there's a lot of subjectivity involved. You really someone has to go in there and say, this is right, this is wrong. So what's right in U.S. may be wrong in Austria. So things like that. So to have a uniform basis that only this is right, only that is right. So I think that's where Facebook is coming from. You really can't enforce that. And already Facebook is under assault in the United States for being too left-leaning and censoring conservative thoughts. So and they've realized that human intervention causes subjectivity. They don't want that. Machines, the algorithms are also tending to be more biased. So they're still working on it. They're trying to be as impractical, as objective as possible. So all that is work in progress. It's going on. But to make such a broad statement that you absolutely have to enforce everything, and to some extent, these companies are doing it. They realize Google did that. They took off content which was very offensive and for kids and for communal relations and all that. So these companies are aware of that. It's existential threat to them if they don't do that. So they are very aware of this. They're doing it. But to work this into reality, I think it's going to take a lot more steps than just making such a broad ruling.
Right. But let's move back and talk about the fact that these companies are aware of the fact that there are steps need to be taken. Now, even if we talk about, for instance, white supremacy, it took quite some time for Facebook to bring that into the definition of hate speech. And when they did, a separate auditor's report that was released that Facebook itself commissioned stated that that definition was too narrow and it didn't include enough aspects for that to cover a lot of the hate speech that was included in white supremacy language and terminology. Now, in all of this, of course, incidents occur, lives are lost, a lot of stuff happens. Don't you think that requires government intervention?
Yes, and Facebook has admitted to some extent it's ready to be regulated and on certain aspects. And absolutely, any life lost is bad. The only thing is the definition of what's hate speech. Some people have a narrow bandwidth, some have a lot. I think that's what, if we can come up with a uniform system, hate is hate, but to some extent, how much hate is the issue. The freedom of expression, freedom to say whatever you want is a huge aspect of the U.S. Constitution. So I think to enforce that, it's going to require a lot of thought and process and to some extent regulation. And it's moving towards that. Facebook realizes that. It's doing it. So is Google. So ultimately we'll get there. But how broad and how big and how soon is all subject to litigation and negotiation.
Right. Mr. Rao, just another thing that I want a little more clarity on is that states that it already abides by local laws. This is something that it has stated in what is a legal restriction on access to content. It states that it makes sure that whatever is accessed on the internet is according to local laws. What does this mean? What internet access, what content can be accessed on Facebook according to the place in which a person is accessing it from?
Yeah, I think at this point, I think Facebook is really trying to work with the local countries. Like, for instance, in India, the government of India has some requirements. I'm just speaking on my own. I mean, communal relations are very sensitive issues, maybe not that much in U.S. So they're going like case by case and understanding what's required. But to some extent, they can't really be the enforcing mechanism and decide what speech is right and what speech is wrong. I think that's where the problem is coming. So to have one uniform system that this is the right thing to do may not work. In some countries, it's absolutely dangerous. So they're realizing that the governments are putting pressure on that. I think that's what they mean by they're just looking at every country, trying to be sensitive to what's required and what's needed, and working with the local governments to kind of stay within the broad parameters that they define as free speech.
Now, Mr. Rao, as we heard this was, of course, this happened in April 2018 when Mark Zuckerberg testified in front of the Congress, and of course, whatever role Facebook played in Myanmar's genocide. Now, according to this, Facebook was responsible for not taking down hate speech in an orderly fashion, quick enough, which led to the killing of many, many people from the Rohingya community. But now, what I do want to ask, in this specific case, it's unique because governments here are not supporting taking down of this content. They are in fact supporting genocide. They are in fact supporting the hate groups. What policies do social media platforms have in these cases? Which independent policies do they have in which they try to protect fundamental human rights?
Yeah. So I totally agree with what Mark Zuckerberg said there. What they are doing is they are localizing their platforms. They are trying to monitor, take out the hate-mongering figures out of Facebook. That's the first step. Just remove that. But at a much higher level, this hate is really not coming from Facebook. There's an underlying resentment and war and this and that going on. Facebook is just maybe enabling it to some extent, so they need to control that. They need to really clamp down on something like Myanmar is not acceptable, and I think they know that. But there is, it's a question of how do you enforce that? Maybe some good people might get well-intentioned, though slightly provocative. People might also get cut out from the whole platform. So they have to make that distinction, and that's why they're hiring local people, localizing their platforms, trying to get the best thing out of them. So I think that's where the issue is, and it's going to take some time before we come to some kind of a normal, kind of a standard system where this is absolutely wrong. Wrong is wrong, and right is right. I mean, that distinction has to be made. Everything is not okay. So, but to get there, you need to really jump the hoops in terms of regulations and freedom of speech and all the other areas of the laws to kind of get to that point.
Right.
And I think the governments and Facebook are aware of that, and they're working on that.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Santosh Rao, for joining us and talking to us. Now we're joined by Mr. Abdinor Dahir, who's a Sudan expert, joining us from Istanbul. Thank you so much, Mr. Dahir, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Now, just trying to look at the other side of this story. While we're talking about social media being the breeding ground for terrorism, for being the breeding ground for extremism and hate, it is also the breeding ground. It is also fostering revolution in many parts of the world. Social media is often clamped down on by authoritarian governments when there is revolution, when there is protest. Take us through how social media can play a positive role, and if governments try to restrict it, how that can play an adverse impact on society.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think social media has been an effective tool for a lot of people across the world, especially in Africa. If we see the latest example in Algeria or in Sudan, where months of protests against the regimes led to the downfall of dictatorships in those two countries. Especially in Sudan, there has been social media, especially Twitter, has played a great role in bringing down Omar al-Bashir from power. And because people were able to use and mobilize themselves using this social media tool, especially and when they create hashtags like Tasqut Bes, which means just fall, and people were able to use this because in the normal media, especially in the websites and TVs and radios, were not allowed to broadcast the protesters. So the protesters were able to unite forces, to join hands and understand and what is going on, and at the same time also, people outside of the country in Sudan were able to follow the situation in the country and understand what was going on. And the regime tried to restrict the social media in the country, but people were also able to use virtual private networks, which also led people to communicate with the outside world as well as between them. And internet shutdowns is not something new in Sudan or in Algeria. It's something, a phenomenon in Africa where governments usually shut down internet and the social media in order to stop protests and movements and opposition groups in their countries. So I think while, as you said, in other countries in the world, social media may become a breeding ground for terrorism, it's also a freedom fighter tool in other countries or in other regions of the world where dictatorships and poverty is very rampant. So I think it's not always negative.
Right. So where do we try to find a balance in the entire debate where on one hand, countries want to protect civilians, on the other hand, they want to use social media as a way of repression or try to clamp down on social media as a way of repression? Where do you think a balance can be struck in all of this?
I think social media and internet is a basic human right according to the UN Charter. So the striking balance is that the governments are always obliged to give access of information to their citizens, access of a network, access of, in today's world, it's 21st century, is the century of information, the century of networking and connectedness. So I think there should be some laws that govern and restrict the use of and violence, the spread of radicalization in social media. But I think governments should not be allowed and should not be working to restrict the use of social media, whether it's in the developed world or the developing or underdeveloped world. So I think social media should be encouraged. People should be allowed to use it and just to communicate and to become better citizens, because it allows them to share information, to bring governments to accountability, and to talk to reach out to the outside world.
Right.
So I think the nuclear option of shutting down internet or restricting social media access is not sustainable, and it should not be a government policy.
Right. And Mr. Dahir, that's a point I want to ask another guest who's joined, Mr. Leonid Petrov, who's a political analyst joining us from Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Petrov. Now, while we're talking about this and the fact that, as Mr. Dahir said, that governments shouldn't be involved in trying to control social media at all, do you share that viewpoint as well, given the scandals we've seen in the past, given the history we've seen unfold before our eyes in terms of fake news, misinformation?
Well, yes, absolutely. It all depends on what Constitution says. And say in Russia, the Article 29 expressly bans censorship. Russia has a long history of censorship in the Soviet era, but since 1991, it was expected to be free for everyone to express the views. And what we've seen earlier this year, in March 2019, two controversial laws have been adopted in Russia, the so-called fake news law and the defamation or disrespect of government law also were introduced. And they create an atmosphere where people don't know what to say, whether to open their mouth or not. The joke is saying that if you try to blame corrupt officials for something, you may be liable for the defamation law. But if you try to praise them, you will be subject to the fake news law. So there's no way out of this. And it looks like the most recent ruling of the European Court of Justice also creates this atmosphere. Google was permitted to go away with the so-called right to forget law, but Facebook fell the victim of the censorship. So it depends on what the Constitution say, and it looks like the power of legislation also has to interpret it correctly.
Right. But Mr. Petrov, while we're talking about what happens internally within countries, isn't it true that it is because of countries and Cold Wars being waged between countries and secret information wars being waged between countries? That's why governments are becoming more and more conscious of trying to control social media, whether we take it from the Russian interference in the US elections in 2016 or other influences being done in order to trigger protests or revolutions?
Yes, it's a good point. I believe that democracy gives the freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of beliefs and expression and associations. But once the environment changes, like from the détente into the rapprochement and then to the new Cold War again, it looks like even the democratic institutions start to fold. As if we speak about Russian situation, Russia found itself isolated because of its actions in Ukraine, in Georgia. We saw that the wars which in 2008 and 2014 and the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula created the environment where Russian media was not free to express the whole plethora of views. People were banned from, say, Channel 1 or Russian state television because they disagreed with the Kremlin's policy. So obviously, censorship exists, and also, most importantly, these days, in the atmosphere of fear and potential, search of a witch hunt for so-called foreign agents, people start to impose self-censorship on themselves, and it looks like it creates the atmosphere where people move away from the open or traditional media, television, radio, go into new media, into YouTube, into Facebook was until recently has been the free platform for expression of views, but these days even putting a like for some controversial news may put you into trouble. So right. Clearly, when we live in a Cold War era, it creates a freeze in freedoms.
Right. Mr. Dahir, just going back to you and talking a little more about why engagement with social media is so crucial for a country that's in a transition of any kind, whether it's from an authoritarian state to a democracy, or whether it's undergoing some sort of a crisis? Why is engagement of the youth with social media so critical in this day and age?
Well, I think because it's very important for when a country is in transition. For one reason is that when a country is in a crisis, like let us say in a disaster or in a flood or when a bomb hits somewhere, people are able to usually give information and to give fast aid or emergency aid so that lives could be safe. For example, in those in situations like in Africa, where like Somalia, where Al-Shabaab usually operates, or in Nigeria, where Boko Haram usually kidnaps people or attacks in civilian areas, people usually are able to focus and to understand what is going on through social media. And also in countries where democracy is there, like countries where when there is election, let me say, people are also able to organize themselves and to understand where the voting and polls are taking place and to understand the situation. And at the same time, when there is a conflict, at the same time, people are also able to understand not to go to somewhere because there is a conflict there, or to know the areas where the danger could be. So I think social media is very, very important for developing countries like Africa, and where especially people have a very difficult to access information. So social media is an alternative, and I believe should not be controlled.
And another thing here is not just social media to create awareness, but also to foster empathy for different parts of the world, for a very isolated part of the world. Some part of the world you probably haven't heard enough about, or some part of the world you could not even relate to. And then you hear about it, you hear about the stories coming out of there, you hear about a figure that you relate to or an icon, and then all of a sudden you feel for that region. How do you feel like that in itself could create awareness internationally for that region?
That's absolutely a perfect example of how media, especially the new media or social media, the advantage of the social media, because, for example, today there is a clampdown in Kashmir where people are not allowed or they are put under arrest. And the only way that we could understand the situation is in Kashmir is just through the social media or some international media. But international media, how they get information, they go there and understand the information of people in Kashmir. So I think social media is an effective tool to create the sympathy and foster understanding between communities across different parts of the world. And that's what's happening now across many parts in the world, in Palestine, in Myanmar, in Kashmir, and many areas in the world where access of information is very difficult. And I think now, as I said, we are in an information age, and the more you have access to power, the more you have access to information, the more you have power. And social media is actually playing an active role and saving lives sometimes.
Right. Mr. Petrov, now we've talked about all of this, how it's essential in many parts of the world for social media to foster, for those voices to be heard which would otherwise never be heard of, for those stories to be told which would otherwise be hidden or completely be put under the ground. Now, in all of this, of course, we need to keep in mind that fake news and misinformation plays a role. What do you think needs to be done to tackle this?
Well, it's hard to say what can be done immediately. It depends on what the reaction of the providers is going to be. Say, Mark Zuckerberg is now liable to follow the government instructions under the jurisdiction of EU and probably beyond to do something. Say, with Russia, it's a much more closed environment, so the data has to be stored on the Russian territory. That's what Russian government demands from Facebook, and some platforms have been already closed. For example, LinkedIn doesn't exist in Russia anymore because the Russian government believed it was too damaging to maintain the database of so many Russian citizens on a foreign server. It depends on what the providers and platforms going to do about these draconian rules and laws which curtail the freedom of speech and freedom of information. Whether they're going to stay in this country or legislation or not. And I think it's difficult to say on behalf of this, say, if Facebook or Google, say Google left China, but Facebook also has difficulties in China, but say in Russia, they still operate. And even so that the Russian government now contemplates the possibility of operating in the circumstances when internet is going to be, Russia is going to be disconnected from the internet, either externally or internally. So turning from internet into intranet would leave no space for platforms like Facebook to operate, and other social media will need to decide for themselves to comply with the government restrictions and regulations or to leave or protest. And I think it depends it will be a case-by-case decisions, and much will depend on the leadership of those platforms.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Leonid Petrov, for joining us. And thank you, Mr. Abdinor Dahir, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we discuss with everything that is happening, how is the growth of social media platforms being impacted? Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, the role of social media in spreading fake news and causing devastating privacy breaches is one of the most hotly discussed topics of the modern age. But with all the scandals and fears, have powerful platforms such as Facebook and Twitter actually suffered in terms of growth and revenue? And with increasing suspicion regarding social media sites, are users becoming more cautious? That's our discussion. Joining us for this discussion today, Mr. Thomas Donohoe, who is the CEO of Level Agency and author of the CEO's Digital Marketing Playbook. He's joining us from Charleston. We're also joined by Ms. Ieva Miluna, who's an international law expert, joining us from Lativa. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Donohoe, I'd like to start with you. Now, give us a sense of how the numbers and figures have been in terms of growth trends and revenue for social media platforms, specifically Facebook, in the past year or so. Have they been going upwards?
Sure. So not just for Facebook, for Twitter, for LinkedIn, for Google, every one of those four major platforms in 2019 has seen moderately explosive year-over-year growth. And I'm talking 16, 20, upwards of 30% year-over-year increases in revenue. So they've had a very good year, every single one of them.
Right. So what do you think is pushing those numbers up?
The primary driver of every social media platform's good year, and Google's and LinkedIn's, is the fact the economy is still quite good, certainly in the United States, and that is the primary driver. The more companies spend on advertising, the more that they can advertise their products to consumers, and consumers are buying them, they'll spend more money. And certainly the economy has been quite good in 2019.
Right. And I want to get to what advertising revenue is all about and whether the restrictions on advertisements has impacted the revenue at all. But before that, I want to talk to Ms. Miluna a little about whether she thinks that with all the scandals that have been breaking out, have they really impacted consciousness in terms of user behavior when they're on these social media platforms?
Well, definitely, misinformation impacts individuals at a more individually social level because, well, it depends whether individuals are forming much more social circles among themselves and with the help of social media. So every aspect of misinformation impacts individuals, where also I can see three parties: a state, national and international news agencies, and social media. So, for example, if there is an armed conflict situation, people don't know where to get the humanitarian assistance if three of those sources mislead an individual.
Right. And even though misinformation is impacting people and people are becoming aware of the fact that social media is fundamentally one of those platforms, not even one, perhaps the platform on which this has become the dominant platform in which fake news is spreading, it doesn't seem that they're backing away from using social media, does it?
No, not at all. Individuals do rely on social media, and it also depends on the different circles and levels. How many people use social media at what level of information, and how the information, how much it is widespread and affects the masses amount of people.
Right. Mr. Donohoe, now more people are becoming aware of the fact that something of privacy, their privacy being leaked, has to do with the fact that Facebook and social media is collecting their data for more targeted advertisement. And even with all of that, with all these scandals, it seems like Facebook's advertisement revenue is increasing, while Facebook itself is saying that it is increasing its restrictions on privacy. It's going to be more careful this time. Help us make sense of this. Is Facebook doing anything about its privacy controls?
So the simple answer is kind of. Agencies like mine are the pipelines for their revenue. And so just to give you a high level, Facebook this quarter will probably make about $20 billion in revenue. Google's going to make about $40 billion. And that's just in the past 3 months. Advertisers, whom we represent, and the other hundreds of agencies like ours that funnel hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to Google and to Facebook, to be very clear, it's not that we don't care about the impact of social media on culture, their duty, or their lack of restraining fake news. At the end of the day, advertisers will spend money on any of these platforms if they can put dollars into the system and get out customers at a good profit, a good cost per acquisition. So it's not to say that advertisers and Facebook don't have a duty to put their products on a platform that observes and respects the truth. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a business relationship. And so advertisers care about dollars out and customers in. And right now, specifically Facebook and Google make our clients a ton of money. So as long as the active users are going to respond well to advertisement, they're going to keep spending money. And just to Leva's point, every day there are 1.5 billion people on Facebook. That's the daily active users. So the audience alone, to say nothing of the profitability, they're going to have a good year and they're going to have a good next year, regardless of the degree of fake news, to be honest.
Right. Mr. Donohoe, now you have given us a sense of the relationship between these social media platforms, specifically Facebook, marketers and advertisers. But I do want your take on the relationship between Facebook's and the users, especially the ones, the common users, those who are on these platforms. Do you think their relationship has changed in any way? Do you think Facebook, let's put the marketers and advertisers on the side, do you think Facebook is doing anything more than, let's say, the last year to protect their privacy?
Sure. So they've done a bit. They have, with the upcoming elections in the United States, especially the large presidential election, they have made some restrictions and some efforts to curtail fake news when the advertisements are coming specifically, or when the messages are coming specifically from a political campaign. So they have set out new regulations that will police and curate to an extent and fact check political advertisements. But as we shared before, that does not include what we'd call political action committees or advocacy groups. So Facebook in particular, as an example, they've done a bit. They certainly have, in the past 3 or 4 years since the 2016 election, where they're from not naming countries, but some countries did actively try to disseminate fake news to average users. There have been some efforts to either restrict their access, these individual fake accounts, and there are certainly aggressive efforts to not allow those to advertise. But at the end of the day, there is still going to be a significant amount of individual profiles that might spread disinformation, and certainly paid advertising will do the same thing. So they've done a bit, but I certainly don't think Facebook in particular has, across the board, been very aggressive. I don't you could say that.
Right. Ms. Ieva Miluna, now, let's see the other side of all of this. Facebook is operating on a business model, something that is, of course, very clear to us given the advertising revenue it earns from all of this. On the consumers and the individuals, and when all of these privacy breaches happen, when everything of this sort happens, they're the ones who are suffering. But it seems like they might not be aware as to what is happening. What do you think needs to happen for them to become more aware? And what do you think needs to happen for them to become more protective?
Well, individuals need to know how to use their human rights, because their human rights might be affected by different activity of the social media. For example, if we take an instance that on the social media, a massive amount of people advertises not to vaccinate newborn children. So, and if people trust that information, then at the end of the day, the state cannot protect the individual, because he or she has been advertised by these news on the social media. So, and there is a threat in my eyes if the social media replaces the state in terms of governance. Some elements in the state of governance are transferred to the social media. Then we have a problem, because human rights operate in the realm that human rights are protected by a state. We cannot go to a court and claim that our human rights have been violated by another private individual or corporation.
Right. So people need to become more aware of their human rights and need to know what is happening, which could perhaps violate their human rights. But when we're talking about social media and the fact that it is so global, what international laws exist for the protection of individuals from the stuff that happens on social media, if there are any?
Well, from international law perspective, we can mostly rely only on human rights documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also in European and American continent from the regional human rights instruments. And they basically entail all the rights that may concern the use of mass media and social media. For example, right to liberty and security, right to private life, right to fair trial, freedom from torture, and freedom of expression. So these are the human rights guarantees that individuals basically have.
Right. Mr. Donohoe, now just a last question to you. Facebook came out with saying that it wants to set up its own court constitution of sorts. It wants to become more hands-on. They want to create a news tab which will have journalists that are going to curate news. They want to do more in order to bring in the human element, to bypass the algorithms. They want to focus on the person more and more. But given that it relies primarily on advertising revenue for its profits, do you think it's realistic to expect anything actually happening, any practical steps being taken in the future?
Sure. I think first and foremost, even if Facebook was purely dedicated to policing or curating or providing a great experience with humans checking humans, it would be absolutely impossible. Every day, as I said, there's with 1.5 billion people just on Facebook, it's completely impossible to staff or to have employees policing or checking everyone's post, or even a very small percentage. So from a manual effort standpoint, even if Facebook wanted to do that, it's going to be very difficult at the individual level. Now, certainly they can police or curate or focus on the honesty, the fake news versus not fake news for larger followers. So individuals or groups or pages that have tens of thousands or millions of followers, that's very possible. But back to your question, I don't really think it's about the revenue. Look, Facebook, as long as they provide a good platform for advertisers to spend money, as long as there are billions of people, they spend hours a day on these platforms, and the nature of the ads are really effective, as long as that equation continues, they're going to make money. But I think your point is, what responsibility do they have? And what does the responsibility of the consumer look like? And on one side, the consumer, keep in mind, human rights or not, this is a voluntary participatory construct, right? It's incumbent upon the individual to use Facebook or not use Facebook. So the question is, what responsibility does Facebook has to provide consumers with a good experience? So I think in the future, it might not be in 2020, maybe in 2021 or 22, I would guess that Facebook in particular might get into the journalism or content creation space and not just be a marketplace of ideas. I think that's possible. But again, to the consumer standpoint, people are voluntarily using Facebook. It's an entertainment platform. And so a large percentage of the, not risk, but the responsibility does fall on the consumer.
Right. On that point, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Thomas Donohoe from Charleston. And thank you, Ms. Ieva Miluna, for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.